Berry Gordy didn't plan to run that day. He was somewhere in the Motown building, probably in a meeting, probably annoyed at something, when his assistant Suzanne DePass came to find him. She'd been trying to get him into that room for weeks. He kept saying no. He didn't want another children's group. He already had Stevie Wonder, and he knew exactly what that meant. Tutors, chaperones, parents in the hallway, legal restrictions on how many hours a minor could work in a single day. Wonder was worth every complication, but Gordy wasn't looking to do it again. When DePass told him there were 5 brothers from Gary, Indiana, waiting to audition, he waved her off. She came back. She always came back. So Gordy eventually walked into the room, reluctantly, already thinking about what else he had to do that afternoon. What happened in the next 40 minutes is something he spent the rest of his life trying to describe. 3 years before that afternoon, a 6-year-old named Michael Jackson stood in front of an audience at Theodore Roosevelt High School in Gary, Indiana. It was a talent show, the kind where families sit in folding chairs and politely applaud every act regardless of quality, because that's what you do. Joe Jackson had entered his sons as a group: Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and Michael, who was 6 and had been added to the lineup because Joe had noticed something. Michael didn't just watch performances. He absorbed them. He'd stand off to the side during rehearsals, completely still, eyes tracking every movement. When Michael stepped up to the microphone that evening, people were patient. He was small. The mic stand was too tall for him. And then he sang. The room changed. Not dramatically. Nobody screamed or jumped to their feet, but people sat up straighter. Conversations stopped. A few people leaned forward in their chairs without realizing they'd done it. Joe Jackson noticed all of this. He didn't say much to Michael afterward. He just made a quiet decision. This was the one they would build everything around. That decision set the next 3 years in motion. Gary, Indiana in the mid-1960s was a steel town. Joe worked at the mill, like most of the men on their street. 10 people lived in a 2-bedroom house on Jackson Street. Money was tight in the way that shapes how a family moves through the world. Carefully, without waste, always watching the edges. Joe was not a gentle man, and he was not a patient one. When he decided his sons would be performers, he meant it with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. Rehearsals were long, standards were high. If something wasn't right, you did it again. But out of that pressure came something that couldn't be manufactured. 5 brothers who moved like a single thing on stage. They'd been rehearsing together so long that the timing was instinctive. They didn't have to think about it. By 1966, they were performing at clubs and theaters across the Midwest. Not school talent shows anymore. Actual rooms with actual audiences who had paid to be there and had no interest in being charitable. They played the Regal Theater in Chicago that year. Gladys Knight was on the bill. She was in her dressing room upstairs when she heard something from below. She walked to the window and listened. Then she went downstairs to see who was on stage. She watched Michael for a few minutes, then went back to her room and called Berry Gordy. "You need to hear these kids," she told him. Gordy thanked her and said he would look into it. He never called back. In August 1967, the Jackson 5 went to New York and entered the amateur night competition at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. The Apollo audience was not forgiving. They had been known to boo acts off the stage, loudly, directly, without any of the polite hesitation of a school gymnasium crowd. You earned their approval or you didn't, and there was nothing in between. The Jacksons won, and then came back the following week and won again, and the week after that. Smokey Robinson was in the audience one of those nights. He watched Michael and felt something he found difficult to categorize afterward. It wasn't just that the boy could sing. Lots of kids could sing. It was the way Michael occupied the stage. The complete absence of self-consciousness, the attention he seemed to draw without reaching for it. Robinson didn't make any calls either. By November 1967, Joe Jackson had been through most of his options. He signed the group to Steeltown Records, a small label operating out of Gary. They recorded a single called Big Boy. It moved some copies locally. It didn't travel. They kept working. July 1968, Chicago, a club called the High Chaparral. The Jackson 5 were the opening act. The headliners were Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, a Motown group with a recent charting single. One of the Vancouver's guitarists was a man named Tommy Chong. Yes, the same Tommy Chong who would spend the next decade becoming famous as half of Cheech and Chong. That night, he was just a guitar player in a club on the South Side, watching a 9-year-old kid walk out onto a stage. Michael opened his mouth. Tommy Chong stopped what he was doing. Bobby Taylor had been in music long enough to know the difference between a talented kid and something else entirely. When the set ended, he didn't go to his dressing room. He went backstage and found Joe Jackson. The next morning, Taylor called Motown's A&R department. He asked them to set up a formal audition. He didn't frame it as a suggestion. He insisted. Around the same time, the Jacksons got a different kind of offer. David Frost wanted them on his television program, national broadcasts, the kind of exposure that a struggling group from Gary, Indiana, didn't say no to. Not in 1968, not when the alternative was driving to Detroit to audition for a man who had already ignored Gladys Knight's personal recommendation. Joe said no to Frost. He put his sons in the family's Volkswagen van and drove to Detroit, Hitsville, USA, 2648 West Grand Boulevard, the building where Motown recorded its music, where the Temptations had tracked their vocals, where Marvin Gaye had stood at the same microphones, where the whole sound of a decade had been assembled track by track in a converted house on a residential street. The Jacksons walked in on July 23, 1968. Berry Gordy was in the building but not in the room. He had been persuaded once again to give this audition a chance. And once again he had agreed with the energy of a man doing someone a favor. He stood near the back, waiting for it to be over so he could get on with his day. The older brothers performed first. Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon. The routines were tight. The harmonies were clean and precise. Gordy took note without being particularly moved. These were well-trained kids. He'd seen well-trained kids before. Then Michael stepped forward. He was 9 years old, 5 weeks away from turning 10. He stood at the microphone without any visible anxiety. Not the kind of calm that comes from not caring, but the kind that comes from not needing to think about what you're about to do. The song was Who's Loving You? Smokey Robinson had written it for the Miracles several years earlier. It is a song about heartbreak, about a man sitting alone, knowing he threw away the only thing that mattered, replaying every decision that led him there. It is not a song a 9-year-old has any business singing from the inside. Michael sang it from the inside. Gordy's pen stopped moving. He wasn't writing anything particular, just holding it. He stood still and listened. Later, in interviews on CBS, on NPR, in Time magazine, in conversations that stretched across 40 years, Gordy kept coming back to the same image. He said Michael sang that song like someone who had been carrying that specific heartbreak for 50 years, not performing the emotion, actually carrying it. We could not believe this old man in this young kid's body, he told CBS in 2009. His voice by then was the voice of an old man himself, and he still sounded slightly stunned. Gordy was not a man who ran. He had built an empire from scratch, had stood in rooms with extraordinary people his entire adult life, and had learned a long time ago how to appear unmoved when it served him to do so. But he turned and walked quickly out of the room. He came back with a video camera. He pointed it at Michael and recorded the rest of the audition. Not for the label, not for any strategic purpose. He just knew he needed a record of this. He said later that the thought in his head was simple. He was watching something he would never see again, and he wanted proof that it had happened. After the audition, Michael sat quietly with his brothers. He wasn't nervous or eager. He just waited, the way he always waited, watching, taking things in, not performing patience, but actually feeling it. Gordy pulled to pass aside. They're going to need something a kid would actually sing, he told her. He started humming a melody. It wasn't finished, just a direction, a shape. He handed it to his team of songwriters, Deke Richards, Freddie Perrin, Phonce Mazel. What came out of that hummed idea, after weeks of work, was ABC, the Jackson 5's third single. It went to number 1. So did their first single, and their second, and their fourth. No act in the history of recorded music had ever opened a career with 4 consecutive number 1 singles. The record still stands. When the time came to introduce the group to the press, Berry Gordy had a problem. The truth was too complicated. Bobby Taylor, a mid-level Motown artist with 1 charting record, had discovered them in a Chicago club. Tommy Chong had been standing 5 feet away. That was not a story that moved magazines in 1969. Gordy needed a name people already knew. He told his publicists that Diana Ross had discovered the Jackson 5. Diana Ross introduced them to industry figures at a party in Los Angeles in August 1969. The press printed it. It became the official version of events. Bobby Taylor was not mentioned. Gordy eventually admitted, in later years, that this was a fabrication. He didn't spend much time apologizing for it. In his thinking, the music was the real story. The rest was just the frame around it. In the summer of 2009, 41 years after that audition, Berry Gordy sat for a radio interview with NPR. Michael had died 2 weeks before. Scott Simon asked him what he remembered about the first time he heard Michael Jackson. Gordy was quiet for a moment. "Everything," he said. That's the simple answer. He talked about the 9-year-old at the microphone, about leaving the room to get his camera, about the song and the way Michael sang it. He described it in the particular way people describe things they've turned over in their minds hundreds of times and still can't entirely account for. "It was just so obvious to me that he was a star," he said. There was something specific in his voice. Not exactly grief, not exactly nostalgia, more like the particular weight of having been in the right room at the right moment, knowing it in real time, and still not having words for it 60 years later. Berry Gordy had not wanted to walk through that door. He had more important things to do. He had said no multiple times, but Suzanne DePass had kept coming back, and eventually he had walked in, arms crossed, already thinking about his next meeting. He walked out with a video camera and a decision. Joe Jackson drove his sons home to Gary in the same Volkswagen van. Michael turned 10 in August. The same bedroom, the same small house. 9 other people. Nothing different from the outside. But Gordy was already on the phone. And somewhere in that house, a 10-year-old boy who had just sung a song about heartbreak he had no reason to understand sat quietly, thinking about whatever 10-year-olds think about when no one is watching.